February 2026. An island nation 90 miles from the Florida coast has between 15 and 20 days of crude oil left in reserve. After that, the lights go out for good. Washington just announced sweeping new tariffs targeting any country that dares to sell oil to Cuba. Moscow immediately pledges necessary support. Beijing condemns what they're calling an economic siege. Mexico suspends its commercial shipments while promising humanitarian aid. Meanwhile, in Havana, the blackouts are stretching 26 hours straight. Hospitals are operating without medication. Food prices exceed an entire month's salary by a factor of 10. This isn't 1962, where superpowers negotiated over Cuba's head during the missile crisis. This is 2026, where an island just 90 miles from Miami becomes the testing ground for whether economic warfare can force regime change without a single invasion, and whether Russia and China will actually confront American dominance when the cost becomes real and the consequences become unavoidable. Let's trace exactly how Cuba arrived at this precipice, and more importantly, what happens when that countdown clock hits zero, January 3rd, 2026, 2 in the morning, Caracas, Venezuela. Delta Force operators, backed by CIA intelligence, storm Nicolás Maduro's compound in a raid that lights up the northern Venezuelan sky. Explosions illuminate the darkness as American bombers suppress air defenses across the region. Dozens die in the operation. Maduro himself gets photographed aboard the USS Iwo Jima, blindfolded, wearing soundproof headphones, bound for arraignment in New York on narco-terrorism charges. Among the dead in that raid, 32 Cuban military and intelligence personnel, because Cuba didn't just support Venezuela diplomatically from a distance. Cuba effectively ran Venezuela's entire security apparatus. 32,000 Cuban operatives were embedded deep in Venezuelan intelligence, internal security, even Maduro's personal protection detail. When Delta Force captured Maduro that night, they didn't just arrest one dictator. They killed Cuba's entire economic model in a single operation. Here's why this matters. Venezuela had been supplying Cuba with 46,500 barrels of oil every single day before that raid. This wasn't market-rate crude. This was subsidized oil at below-market prices, the exact arrangement that kept Cuban lights on since Hugo Chavez declared the two countries were living in a sea of happiness back in 1999. The deal was simple. Cuba sent troops, intelligence operatives, and regime protection expertise. Venezuela sent oil. That partnership terminated the exact moment Maduro got arrested and flown to American custody. Mexico had been Cuba's secondary supplier, providing 17,000 barrels per day. Within weeks of the Venezuela operation, those shipments halted too, under direct pressure from Trump administration threats to weaponize the USMCA renegotiation process. Do the math with me here. Cuba loses roughly 63,700 barrels daily from these two sources combined. Cuba needs approximately 60,000 barrels per day just to maintain basic electricity generation across the island. There's no margin for error. There's no backup plan sitting in reserve. There's just the countdown clock ticking toward zero. But Cuba didn't just lose oil supply in this equation. It lost the revenue stream that came from reselling Venezuelan crude at market rates while paying subsidized prices. That hard currency financed food imports, medicine imports, essential goods. That income gone overnight. The military partnership that anchored Cuba's entire regional security posture dissolved. the assumption that great power patrons like Russia and China would seamlessly replace Venezuela if something went wrong, about to get tested under the most extreme pressure imaginable. The Venezuela-Cuba relationship wasn't just some oil deal between neighbors. It was the foundational economic architecture that allowed Cuba's entire system to survive after Soviet subsidies ended in the early 1990s. Between 1999 and 2013, Chavez supplied up to 100,000 barrels daily to Cuba, worth up to $1.5 billion annually. In exchange, Cuba provided the security expertise that kept Chavez, and later Maduro, in power against coup attempts, massive protests, and internal military threats. Cuban operatives trained Venezuelan intelligence services, monitored military loyalty across the armed forces, and protected the president personally with their own bodies. When Maduro faced his own survival crises over the years, Cuban personnel were the regime's absolute backbone, keeping him alive and in power. But here's what that partnership masked for decades: structural economic decay happening underneath the surface. While Venezuelan oil kept the generators running, Cuba's domestic production collapsed across every sector. Sugar harvests that historically measured in millions of metric tons, down to 165,000 tons in the 2024 to 2025 harvest. Real wages adjusted for inflation, down 96% since 2015. Agricultural mechanization. Farmers are literally switching from tractors back to oxen for plowing, and then those oxen get stolen and slaughtered for food because people are starving. The dependency on Venezuela created a fatal vulnerability that Cuba never addressed. When your entire economy runs on someone else's oil like a hospital patient runs on an IV drip, you don't diversify your economy. You don't implement painful reforms. You don't build resilience or redundancy. You just assume the drip continues forever, because it always has, until January 3rd, 2026, when someone cut the line completely. This is the Venezuela lesson now being applied directly to Cuba in real time. Patron-client relationships work perfectly until the patron implodes or gets regime changed by a superpower with overwhelming force. Then your entire model dies too. Cuba didn't have to prepare for this exact scenario because for 25 straight years, it never happened. Now it's happening, unfolding in real time, and there are only 15 days of reserves remaining in the tank. January 29th, 2026. One day before Secretary of State Marco Rubio testifies to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about Cuba policy, President Trump signs Executive Order 14,380. The mechanics are straightforward and brutal. The Commerce and State Departments identify which countries are selling oil to Cuba. The President personally sets tariff rates on goods imported from those countries. If the oil shipments continue, the tariffs escalate automatically. The threat is explicit: help Cuba and pay an economic price that far exceeds whatever profit you might make from the oil sales. But listen carefully to Rubio's Senate testimony on January 28th. He acknowledges explicitly, on the record, that regime change is the goal. The 1996 Helms-Burton Act legally codifies the embargo until Cuba's government changes completely. Title III of that act, activated by Trump in 2019 after 20 years lying dormant, allows U.S. nationals to sue Cuban entities and international companies for properties that were expropriated after the 1959 revolution. The Supreme Court is currently hearing cases on whether Cuban government entities should lose sovereign immunity protections, creating legal pathways to seize Cuban assets globally if regime change eventually succeeds. This isn't about human rights accountability or democratic reforms. This is about economic siege as regime change doctrine, clearly stated and actively pursued. Mexico feels the pressure immediately and intensely. Republican lawmakers Carlos Jimenez, Mario Diaz-Balart, Maria Elvira Salazar explicitly threatened to weaponize the USMCA renegotiation process if Mexico keeps selling oil to Cuba. Trump personally calls President Claudia Sheinbaum, requesting she suspend the shipments. Sheinbaum's navigating an impossible tightrope here. Her leftist political orientation demands solidarity with Cuba and the broader Latin American left. But Mexican economic survival depends entirely on avoiding tariffs that would devastate exports to the United States, Mexico's largest trading partner, by an enormous margin. Her compromise solution: commercial oil sales get halted under American pressure. Humanitarian assistance, food and medical goods delivered via Mexican Navy vessels, gets pledged and actually delivered. Oil shipments specifically for humanitarian reasons remain under active diplomatic negotiation, with both sides talking while the clock ticks down. The distinction matters legally and diplomatically, but functionally, Cuba's losing those 17,000 barrels per day either way. The international community votes 165-7 against the embargo at the UN General Assembly. International law scholars are calling these secondary sanctions, tariffs imposed on third countries for their independent commercial transactions, clear violations of national sovereignty. The U.S. frames the entire policy as accountability for a regime that tortures dissidents and currently imprisons 650 political prisoners arrested during the July 2021 protests. Washington has successfully turned oil into a choke point, a single point of failure in Cuba's entire system. Now, the critical question becomes, who is actually willing to break the blockade with real tankers carrying real oil, and who just makes empty promises while American satellites track every empty tanker route across the Atlantic? Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov immediately calls the U.S. pressure unacceptable and pledges necessary political and material support. Russia condemns Executive Order 14,380 as illegal under the UN Charter. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova frames this as Washington's maximum pressure strategy, blatantly violating international law and norms. Here's what they're actually doing beyond the rhetoric. Rosneft loaded 100,000 tons of crude onto a tanker called the Academic Gubkin in January, with expected arrival at Cuba's Matanzas terminal in mid-February. 100,000 tons translates to roughly 20 days of consumption at current rates. That buys Cuba some time. It doesn't solve the underlying crisis. And critically, the volumes are declining sharply over time. Russia sent 600,000 tons in 2022, only 200,000 in 2023, and just 100,000 in 2024. Russia's constrained by Ukraine war, resource demands, international sanctions targeting its shadow tanker fleet, and fundamentally limited capacity for major Caribbean commitments when it's fighting an existential war in Europe. Moscow maintains the Lord's intelligence facility in Cuba, demonstrating global reach and presence. But Russia won't risk direct U.S. military confrontation over Cuba when it's already stretched thin. Signaling presence is one thing. sustaining a besieged economy 90 miles from Florida indefinitely, that's something else entirely. Beijing condemns the blockade in strong language, pledges as much support as possible, and votes with the 165-nation majority against the embargo at the UN. China frames this as principled opposition to unilateral coercive measures that violate sovereignty and international norms. What's conspicuously missing from China's response? Confirmed oil shipments actually sailing toward Cuba. China's investing in Cuban infrastructure projects, holding high-level diplomatic meetings, signaling great power status on the world stage. But Chinese tankers aren't actually sailing for Havana with crude oil in their holds. Beijing won't directly challenge U.S. hemispheric dominance specifically for Cuba when the risks include potential economic retaliation that could cascade through China's core strategic interests globally. The telling silence here speaks volumes. Diplomatic rhetoric costs absolutely nothing. Crude oil deliveries cost real money and carry real geopolitical consequences. That gap between words and actions defines so-called great power solidarity. Sheinbaum's caught between revolutionary solidarity. Her political base expects vocal support for Cuba and the Latin American left, and economic survival. Pemex supplies only 3% of its crude exports to Cuba. That's minimal economically, but it's massive politically, both domestically in Mexico and internationally. The brutal reality. If Sheinbaum caves completely to American pressure, Cuba hits zero oil reserves in 15 to 20 days maximum. If she defies Trump openly, Mexico risks crippling tariffs that dwarf Cuba's strategic importance to Mexico by orders of magnitude. So she splits the difference. Humanitarian aid flows through official Mexican Navy channels. Commercial sales stop under American pressure. Diplomatic negotiations continue publicly, while the countdown clock keeps ticking privately. Mexico's the only realistic near-term supplier with geographic proximity and actual production capacity to help, and Washington knows this perfectly well. The oil deliveries get tracked in real time by American satellites. While diplomats talk in comfortable offices, Cuba's reserves drain barrel by barrel. Here's what that looks like on the ground for ordinary Cubans. 26 consecutive hours of blackouts in many regions across the island. The Antonio Guterres thermoelectric plant sitting offline, eliminating 200 megawatts of generating capacity. The national electricity deficit hitting 75% of total demand during peak evening hours. Energy analyst Victoria Grabenwoga from Kepler. Cuba can function for 15 to 20 days at current consumption rates. After that, energy collapse. No electricity means no water pumping infrastructure. Artemisa province sees 83% reduction in water access. Havana, 80% reduction. No refrigeration means immediate food spoilage in tropical heat. No hospital equipment functioning. No public transportation moving people. The peso lost 10% of its value in just 3 weeks, as of early February. It's down 88% total since 2020. The informal exchange rate hits 405 pesos per dollar versus the official rate of 24. That's not a gap. That's a chasm showing complete currency collapse. Food prices in early 2026 tell the starvation story. Potatoes cost 450 pesos per pound, onions 380, beans 500, meat 1,000. A modest grocery purchase for a small family, 10,300 pesos. The average state worker salary, 6,830 pesos monthly. Teachers earn 5,495. Healthcare workers earn $6,562. A Cuban doctor earning 4,500 pesos earns roughly $16 monthly at informal exchange rates, $16 per month for a doctor. Disease outbreaks are accelerating. Oropouche fever and chikungunya. 38,938 cases with 33 deaths in 1 week in late 2025. 21 of those deaths were children. Hospitals lack diagnostic reagents, antibiotics, the most basic medical supplies. Patients get sent home to rest without any treatment because medications literally don't exist in the system. The Medilip pharmaceutical company expands production of plant-based syrups, oregano, eucalyptus, aloe vera, not because they work medically, but because there's absolutely nothing else available. A 69-year-old housekeeper reports her 10-minute commute now takes 4 hours round trip due to complete transportation collapse, with costs consuming her entire wages. A 32-year-old woman says survival is everything. Nothing else matters anymore. Neither the government nor the opposition offers any hope. Taxi drivers queue at digital position 2,900, estimating 2 months, waiting time just to reach the front of the line for fuel that's sold only in US dollars at massively inflated prices. This is what maximum economic pressure looks like in actual practice, on the ground, for real human beings. While Washington, Moscow, and Beijing play geopolitical chess at the strategic level, ordinary Cubans are counting hours of darkness and wondering if the lights will ever come back on. Now, the critical question: can the regime actually survive what's coming in the next few weeks? President Miguel Diaz-Canel's public messaging remains defiant, uncompromising, revolutionary to the core. Patria o muerte, homeland or death. We will never surrender. Dialogue is theoretically possible, but only on equal terms with mutual respect, without preconditions imposed from outside. But dialogue absolutely cannot occur under external pressure or threat. Military readiness rhetoric intensifies. War of the entire people. Exercises. National Defense Day events invoking the costs imperialism would pay for attacking Cuba militarily. References to the 32 Cubans killed fighting American forces in Venezuela get repeated constantly. But the material constraints tell a completely different story beneath the rhetoric. The Cuban military declined from 300,000 personnel to just 60,000 during earlier economic crises. Military training gets suspended entirely due to resource shortages. Agriculture is literally switching from tractors back to oxen, which then get stolen and slaughtered for food because people are starving. Tourism is down 72% through April 2025 compared to previous years. Sugar production hit 165,000 tons versus historical production in the millions. The Economic Commission for Latin America forecasts Cuba's GDP shrinking 1.5% in 2025, with barely any growth projected for 2026, making it the second worst performing economy in the entire Western Hemisphere after Haiti. The cohesion question becomes critical. Does the Giza military apparatus maintain elite unity when they can't even provision their own core supporters? Do internal factions emerge around negotiation strategies versus resistance strategies? 650 political prisoners remain jailed from the 2021 protests. Repression capacity remains intact for now, but public exhaustion deepens every single day. Trump's strategy remains deliberately ambiguous. Public messaging: Cuba is ready to fall, going down for the count. I don't think we need any action. But also, I think we're going to make a deal with Cuba. No timeline specified, no terms mentioned. Politico reports a naval blockade is under active discussion in administration circles. The strategy appears to be use energy as a chokehold to kill the regime without invasion. The regime says it won't surrender. Washington says collapse is inevitable. Neither claim tells you what actually happens in the next 30 days. Let me walk you through 5 possible scenarios, each with different probabilities. Scenario 1. Negotiated transition. The regime accepts face-saving dialogue leading to political reforms, prisoner releases, limited economic opening. Trump declares victory. Sanctions ease gradually. Venezuela potentially restores limited oil flows under new leadership. This requires both sides accepting compromise. Neither has shown willingness to accept yet. Scenario 2. Managed decline. International support from Russia and China provides just enough oil to prevent total system failure, but not enough for restoration to previous levels. The crisis becomes a permanent condition. 12-hour daily blackouts become normal. Severe scarcity continues indefinitely. The security apparatus maintains political control. The population lacks organization for sustained uprising. Special period 2.0, indefinite duration. Scenario 3. Internal fracture. Oil runs out completely. Essential services collapse entirely. Elite unity breaks when Giza can't feed its own core supporters anymore. Military coup, reformist transition, or negotiated exit, depending on whether internal factions see survival in regime change versus doubling down on resistance. Scenario 4. External intervention. Naval blockade gets imposed to halt all remaining oil imports. Supreme Court rulings potentially jeopardize legal authorities, forcing consideration of military options. Russian and Chinese responses remain unknown variables. Unlikely probability, but not impossible if humanitarian catastrophe creates overwhelming political pressure for rescue operations. Scenario 5. Unexpected stabilization. Russia or China dramatically increases support as a multipolarity demonstration. Trump accepts a face-saving deal for domestic political reasons. A transitional Venezuelan government restores limited oil flows. This requires all major actors shifting their positions simultaneously. Possible, but requires perfect timing. 5 scenarios. 1 countdown clock. 15 to 20 days of oil remaining. Cuba validates exactly what Venezuela already proved. Economic models built entirely on external subsidies collapse catastrophically when the patron disappears or gets removed. Venezuela had domestic oil infrastructure that could be reactivated post-Maduro. Cuba has nothing but hope for external rescue from the powers that won't risk confrontation. Russia and China pledge rhetorical solidarity, but won't risk direct confrontation with the United States in its own sphere of influence. Symbolic shipments buy temporary time. They don't change fundamental trajectories. The multipolar world order means rhetorical support and limited material aid, and not decisive intervention that changes outcomes. Maximum pressure isn't an abstraction or talking point. It's 11 million people facing blackouts, hunger, disease outbreaks, and systemic collapse. Oil consumption has no ideology. Barrels per day matter. Rhetoric doesn't. The Americans who captured Maduro on January 3rd might have signed Cuba's death warrant. Or it might force the regime change Washington's pursued for 65 consecutive years. Or it might trigger the great power confrontation everyone tried desperately to avoid. It's February 2026. Cuba has 15 to 20 days of oil left in reserve. The countdown continues. The final verdict isn't in yet, but the clock is absolutely running.